Well, welcome to this edition of No Nonsense from Moosejaw, Saskatchewan. I went to high school here, and as I was growing up, lived with my grandmother, and I would hear all these stories of what had happened on River Street in Moosejaw, that Al Capone had run whiskey and booze underneath the streets, that there were tunnels where the Chinese lived to service the railway. It was very, very exciting for a teenager, and we didn't really know whether it was legend or lore or actually just part of the legacy and the history of a small prairie city and a country that was opening itself up in the wild, wild west. More than 20 years ago, these tunnels underneath the city did actually exist. They were opened up for the public to come and see, with actual performers telling the stories of what might or might not have gone on underground, the tunnels of Moosejaw. And with us today, Bobby Hill, the general manager. Welcome, it's great to see you.
Great to see you again, thanks for having us.
Okay, dealing with COVID, let's start there.
Well, I had mentioned to you before, the Tunnels of Moosejaw it's a new employer for myself.
Yeah.
And turns out getting into the tourism industry in 2019 wasn't the best idea, but we worked our way through it.
Yeah.
And here we are. We were closed for 17 months.
Wow.
So it has been a struggle.
Yeah.
But we do have a very good team working here.
Yeah.
And we're happy to be on the outside of it.
I think we're going to get to the stories of Al Capone and the life, the sometimes horrific life of the Chinese that lived underground. But I want to start because when I was here 2 or 3 years ago, you were just in the process of building what is now called Bunker 24. Huge, massive building that used to be a place where they brought all the vegetables and fruit that came off the trains. And you have transformed that into, you explain what Bunker 24 is.
Yeah, so what we did with Bunker 24 is tie into Moosejaw's strong military history. And as you'd mentioned, we completed this construction project underneath 2 large buildings on Manitoba Street. So they were originally Rex Wholesale Fruit, and expansion later on added Moose Grocers and the Canadian Wholesale Food Company. So that was right across the street from what we now have as CP Rail.
Right.
So it was an ideal location to bring in that fresh fruit, and so we tie that in to the very start of our bunker story.
Yeah.
And we travel back to 1958 into the early part of the Cold War.
Of the Cold War.
Yes.
This is for those who don't know, there is a base just outside Moosejaw, and everybody, of course, will have heard of the Snowbirds, and this is their home.
Yes.
That base is their home, and there is a really strong connection between the military and the citizens of Moosejaw. Okay, so you get this idea for Bunker 24, a story about the Cold War. We're in the middle of some hot wars these days, but the Cold War period, and what went on in Bunker 24?
So basically what we're telling is Canada's involvement and Moosejaw's involvement, bringing in the BCATP base, which is now 15-wing Moosejaw. So we talk about the growth of that in World War II. And so although our story is set in 1958, we travel a few years through that process.
Yeah.
And, it's a very, as you mentioned, we're in the middle of some hot wars right now. And in the Cold War, we were very close to some severe nuclear consequences.
Yeah.
East versus West. It was the development of nuclear weapons was at its highest point.
Look, kids were being taught how to hide under their desk. Not
Yes.
that that would have given a whit of protection,
Right.
but it was very present in the minds of even school kids at that point.
Absolutely. And, it was the Bikini Atoll testing sites, and they really didn't know the long-term effects
Right.
of nuclear weapons and the fallout.
Right.
So we talk about Canada's communication and the involvement in that. There's a local story that we bring in, a man by the name of Pat Bailey, who was recruited into the military during World War II under Sir William Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked at Camp X and set up a communications base. And grew up in Moosejaw.
Canada's real spies.
Yeah. So we grew up in Moosejaw and attended Central Collegiate.
Yeah.
So we talk about that communications history, and then we talk about the spying on Canadians and listening in on phone calls, and because obviously communism was everything that we fought against, and with Saskatchewan's Socialist Party. There was some big name people locally that were spied on by the RCMP, Security and Intelligence
No, and that was
Branch,
going
right?
on in the U.S., and it was, Hollywood was being routed out, and people were looking for communists under the bed, and I mean, it really was. It's hard to recreate that mindset, but
Yes.
it was real. It was very real.
And I think back to my my education, and the Cold War wasn't something that we learned a lot about. So that was, I do enjoy history.
Yeah.
And so diving into the research, we had a very good research team here at the
Right.
tunnels, but we also partnered with the Forces Base.
Yeah.
And it was incredible, what was uncovered. And to be able to tie that into a 50-minute story, it's, you don't fully do it justice, the
Right.
period of time, but we do our best.
For those who haven't been to the tunnels, and this is just one of the programs, it's you go back in time. I mean, there are different set pieces, and you have actors acting out the parts as if they were there.
Yes.
In that time span. In the 50s, you pick a year, but as you say. So what's the story there? It's seeing what was going on in this bunker in the 1950s right here under everybody's nose, not knowing that they might be the ones spied upon.
Correct. So as our guests, you are new recruits.
Okay.
So when you're pulled into the story, you are new recruits. And we give you as much of the top secret information as we can. And that, as you mentioned, you're kind of immersed into
Yes.
this story, and that's really what we're trying to do, is immerse the audience in the role of a new recruit.
Yeah.
Moosejaw didn't have any major bunkers. There were bunkers in Moosejaw that were built for fallout.
Yeah.
What we tried to recreate was the NORAD base in North Bay.
Right.
And a little bit of NORAD in North Bay and the Defen bunker. So
Right.
So we, our business owner spent a lot of time early on visiting North Bay, visiting the Defen bunker. And
This is Danny.
Danny Gilliam.
And this gets me off on another part of the story, because I've known Danny for many, many years. He's a believer in trying to build communities and save communities as well, because
Yes.
that was what was happening to Moosejaw. I mean, for me, coming from a small town, it was a big city, but Moosejaw's not a big city.
Right.
And it didn't have a lot really going on and he said, look, we have these great stories, let's tell them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was, late 90s.
Yeah.
I believe Danny was home for a family reunion.
Yeah.
And he was walking down Main Street in Moosejaw, and there was many buildings that were slated for demolition.
Yeah.
Grant Hall being one of them.
A very posh hotel in its time.
Yes, and kind of a posh hotel now because it has come back. So that was kind of when he saw that happening in downtown Moosejaw. Obviously, Danny grew up on a farm just north of town, but he spent his life in Moosejaw, went to school here.
Yeah.
So seeing what Main Street looked like really affected him, and he didn't want to see it happen. See these buildings, these beautiful brick buildings, be torn down.
It is a gorgeous Main Street. It's hard to explain that, but all the old bank buildings, all the stores. I remember going to a place called Joiners, and they had these little metal boxes. When you went to pay, they sent them on wires that went up to the accountant, and they made the change. And you know, that was just normal when you're a kid, but when you think back on it now, it's such a sight. There were so many of those little things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joiners burned down in I forget what year it was. I was a kid. I remember the fire, and I remember those little rail.
Yes.
Change
miniature
rail.
Train cars.
Yeah. But what they ended up doing in downtown Moosejaw is selling off these buildings. I believe it was just kind of back taxes were paid, and it was really the start of something in downtown Moose Jaw. Obviously, we have mine outside town that keeps a lot of people employed. We have CP Rail that keeps a lot of people employed, and agriculture is huge around here, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
But our downtown core was dying.
Yeah.
So the spa kind of gave things a boost.
With the mineral waters, the special healing waters.
Yes.
And
then the tunnels started. Danny spent a lot of time researching the bootlegging history.
Well, let's talk about that a bit, because honestly, this was, I don't know why we thought it was a secret when we were kids, but I guess it was passed on from one to another. Did you know that Al Capone came to town and he was underneath River Street? I mean, Al Capone did come to town.
He did. He did. I know, I believe it was his niece, Deirdre Capone, was here a few years ago.
Yeah.
And through conversations that she had with Al, he kind of referred to Moosejaw in Saskatchewan as God's country. Like, this was the place to be.
You could also get away with whatever you wanted.
With whatever you want. So
he was actually making booze here and then bootlegging it or running it down to Chicago. Like, what actually happened?
So prohibition in Canada and the U.S. was very different. Obviously, the initial prohibition, there's nothing.
Right.
But in Canada, the law changed so that you could produce, but you could not sell in Canada. So that was perfect for the Capone organization. And we have the direct Sioux line down to Chicago. So they were buying Seagrams and disguising it in rail cars and sending it back. So that's really what brought him here, is the fact that in Canada you can make it, and you have these.
Such a crazy rule. You can produce it, but you can't sell it.
Yeah, you can produce it, but you can't sell it. And in the United States, they were dealing with prohibition. So who are you selling it to?
Yeah.
Right. But River Street in Moose Jaw was quite the place.
Yeah.
You hear about it was, in the 1920s, you have a lot of bachelor farmers in these small towns outside Moose Jaw. So on the weekends, River Street was a party. And
the women of the night, and as they not tactfully referred to them, the whorehouses were aplenty.
Yes, and that's something that I think when it comes to the history, and kind of the conservative views in Saskatchewan,
right?
That's why a lot of those things weren't talked about, because it's like, it happened, but we don't have to be proud of it.
Saturday night on River Street and Sunday morning to church.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember raising with my grandmother and asking her questions. She said, well, that's not something polite young ladies would talk about, that kind of thing. And
Yes.
so it is hard to find that history because, like so many bits of history, it's word of mouth.
Yes.
Right? It's stories told. People weren't writing these down.
Gangsters don't write things like that down.
No,
So.
they don't do their memoirs as they might now. But so that part of the tour, what's the story there? Is it just explaining what went on? As a participant, who are you?
Yeah, so you are you're working for the Capone organization.
Okay.
You're the new people in town.
Yep.
We bring you across the street to Miss Fanny's club, and she kind of gives you the down low.
Yep.
And brings you down into the underground operation where you're met by Gus, who is a kind of Capone's right-hand man north of the border. And so what you're doing is learning the ropes of the operation and how we disguise the booze and where we take it. So it's, and with the CP rail line right across the street, it makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. Who are the people where do you get the actors, the storytellers, not the public that's coming in to participate and take on their role, but you've got full-time people here.
Yes, we do. We have a lot of local high school students who are interested in drama and acting. But we also have a few that have come to us from Saskatoon who are involved in acting, and it's tough to find a full-time acting job in the prairies for sure. And so we've been able to keep some amazing young actors employed for quite some time.
Yeah.
We have some people who have been here for 15 years.
That is amazing.
Yeah, kind of right out of high school. We have a couple young actors right now at 14 and 15 years old, part of the youth program.
Yeah.
And it's really incredible to see the passion in the art from these young kids.
Well, and they're also learning. I mean, they're also learning these stories. Now, the first one that opened was the story of the Chinese living underground, and there's variations on the story there, that they were kind of indentured labor for the railway, doing the laundry, doing the meals, that there was anti-Chinese sentiment, and so they simply went there to live and to hide and to huddle together, and they created businesses. What's your sense of what actually went on?
So what we portray in the story that we tell is after the railway was built, the Canadian government and the National Rail Line didn't have a use for all of these Chinese workers
that they brought over to build the railway. And treat badly.
Yes. So what ended up happening is a head tax was put in place. Initially, I believe it was $50 per person, per immigrant, that only Chinese people had to pay in order to stay in Canada. And $50 in 1907, 1900s,
that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And when the Chinese continued to come and the Chinese continued to pay, the government increased the head tax to $100. Same thing happened. They continued to come, they continued to pay, they increased it to $500. So over 81,000 Chinese immigrants paid the head tax. And I believe at that time it was around $23 million paid to the Canadian government by these Chinese immigrants.
Another little part of our history that we don't like to talk about. Yeah.
And but there were compradors that often paid up front for these immigrants, so they were indentured to them.
Yeah.
And they would work, not necessarily in tunnels, but they would work kind of in the shadows of everyday life across Canada.
Yes, it's true. It wasn't just, yes.
This isn't just a Saskatchewan story. And I think that's sometimes where where people do get confused, and we try to do our best at telling the story that this was not a local Saskatchewan or Moosejaw
phenomenon.
This happened across the country, but in the early 1900s, Moosejaw had one of the largest Chinese populations in the prairies because the rail was here, there was work, and Moosejaw was a hub.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there was, that's when people spent the night on trains, did cross-country train trips, the laundry, the sheets, all of that, the towels had to be done somewhere, and the trains had to be restocked.
Yes.
And so being a hub meant all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it didn't end with the head tax because the head tax was abolished in 1923. What happened after that was the Female Employment Act, where many of these Chinese immigrants, after their debts were paid, moved to rural communities, started businesses. We were talking earlier about the Chinese restaurants that you find in almost every
town in
town.
Western Canada.
Yeah.
Every town. 3 in Wadena. I know there's plenty everywhere.
And a law was passed that made it illegal for Chinese people, Chinese business owners, to hire white women. And it was repealed in 1965. So it wasn't that long ago that this happened. And the reason it was repealed is because the white women felt that
they were being discriminated against.
being discriminated against. So, and in 2006, that's when the Canadian government started making the redress payments of $20,000 to this Chinese community. So,
when I went through that exhibit years ago, it was about sort of what had happened to the Chinese, what we as society had done, what the businesses had done, the government, the railway, etc. But your story has changed a little bit. You went and talked with the Chinese community and said, "Help us here."
And what we found is there were two sides to the story from the Chinese community. Many people liked the story because we were showing them as victims, and the other half did not like the story because we were telling the story as victims.
Okay.
So what we decided on with the community was to show the strength, because they are a strong community, and we told it.
Unbelievable work ethic. Just unbelievable.
Absolutely. You come here, you don't know the language. You have all these barriers put in front of you, and you're able to thrive, right? So that's how we're telling this story now, is the strength of the community. Yes, there were these significant hardships put upon them, but at the end of the day, you look at the Chinese community in Canada today, and they're a very strong community.
So about overcoming, not being victimized, although the victimization is there, it's clear, it's part of the history, but it's how they responded.
Yes. Yeah, the growth and the strength.
So what happens when people, and I know you have a lot of school kids that go through, they come from far and wide.
Yeah.
What questions do they ask? Like, how do they react to this? And is there a difference in the communities that you see?
I'd say with school children now, they are more aware coming in.
Right.
I know growing up, I didn't know about this history. There is a Saskatchewan teacher, Mary Bishop, who has written a series of fictional books kind of based around the tunnels story. And those have become curriculum in a lot of schools in Saskatchewan.
Excellent.
So it is helped. Yes, it's a fictional story of a child's journey.
Right.
But they come here with their eyes open to what has happened. And for the most part, we do see children and school groups doing the Passage to Fortune because it is a very strong story. And just to be able to give kids nowadays some perspective is very, very important.
Is Passage to Fortune, which you call it now, was that the original name?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But maybe it's just taken on a different meaning.
There's we hear many things. It's the Chicago connection.
Yeah.
We hear the bootlegger tour, or the booze tour, the Capone tour, and the Passage to Fortune has taken on many different names as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But that's in fact the story you're trying to reflect, is that because of their strength and their fortitude, right? They were able to become business people and entrepreneurs with everything stacked against them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, do you have, are there people coming from outside the country? What's your base?
Well,
everybody in Moosejaw's already seen them.
Well, and funny thing about that is,
or maybe not. Yeah.
I moved back to Moosejaw after 15 years, year and a half ago, and start working at the tunnels and talking to my friends about it. Mm. And there is a lot of my friends who have lived in Moosejaw, never left, and never been to the tunnels. And you hear that from a lot of people. It's it's your local tourist attraction. It's not for us.
Yeah.
It's for tourists. But we're trying to we're trying new marketing strategies to get the local people in, because that word of mouth is huge. And
then they tell relatives. I mean, that's the thing. I said to Paul Boone, who's sitting right over here, who works with me, and I said, so have you been to the tunnels? And he said, no. And I said, okay, you got to go to the tunnels. It's just, and you assume because he was born and raised in Saskatchewan, he knows about it.
Yeah,
but he's been off in the world working.
Yeah, I would say most people know about it.
Yeah.
Whether or not they've been here, that's another thing.
Yeah.
But we, the largest audience that we get is out of Saskatoon and Regina.
Okay.
But during the summer, we get people from all over
passing through
on the number one highway, right?
Yeah.
We get a lot of people from Ontario and Quebec. Manitoba is very good. Everybody's checking out the Rockies, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting, but we don't get a pile of people from, I would say, BC heading east.
Okay.
Right? They got the Rockies.
Yeah, they stay home. Yeah.
They stay home, but there's, a lot of people in the country that want to see what the West has to offer.
So what do you do to bring, we talked about this at the beginning, that trying to, kickstart the tourism business with COVID and still the uncertainty that exists. I mean, some of these tours are underground.
Yes.
So do you find that there's nervousness on the part of people going, oh my God, should I wear a mask? What do I do? Are we trapped? How long is it?
Right. And initially, when we reopened post-COVID, which was July, so we were closed March of 21 to July of 20. March of 20 to July of 21. Initially, everybody was wearing masks.
Yeah.
Saskatchewan pulled the mask mandate later on in that year,
right,
and then put it back into place.
Yes, exactly.
So, kind of what we're doing is going with what the province mandates.
Yeah.
I would say initially, there were a lot of concerns, and we did get comments from guests that we shouldn't have that many people in a tight space together, and I can appreciate that. I understand.
No, this is true about everything. I sit in airplanes talking
Yes.
about tight spaces and close to one another. It's, there's everybody has to kind of choose their own comfort level.
For sure, and we have a business to run that was closed for 17 months.
Yeah.
So I apologize.
Yes, but COVID was not your fault.
No.
So what about the connections? You say the community, like the Chinese community, really stepped up and said, let's look at this together.
Right.
And the same with the Bunker 24, that the military really helped and maybe discovered their own history a little bit through that.
Yeah, and I think with that bunker tour, there is a historian at 15 Wing Moosejaw.
Yeah.
So we worked very closely with him, and he is sharp and he knows his stuff, and
Yeah.
he was a great partner, and the base itself were great to deal with throughout. We did our grand opening in July of this year of Bunker 24. So it was kind of when things were safe. Okay, let's do this. But the commander from the base came, and he had been before to the bunker tour, and he absolutely loves it. He did not know the history. He's a lifelong military man.
Yeah.
But they didn't know everything that was going on. We had Russ Marasti,
The lieutenant governor,
who came down, and he's ex-RCMP.
Right.
So that was kind of, it was a big reason why we wanted him. He's a very important person. He's a great person.
Yeah.
But he's ex-RCMP, and you bring these people in and try to tell this story of that RCMP
spying
on people, and it went over very well.
The story is still there today.
Yes.
Okay, we're still hearing that. It's headlines in 2022 as well.
History has repeated itself.
Yeah. How do you deal with a generation of kids that are used to these machines here, and the present? They can do anything in mere seconds and go anywhere and see the world in any way they want, and you're asking them to actually walk through this and immerse themselves and see it. How do they react to that?
It's interesting to see these school groups come in and then walk out.
Yeah.
Because before, they're all hyper, they're all on their cell phones.
Yes. Their teachers made them do this.
Yeah, taking pictures and doing Snapchats, telling everybody where they are.
Yeah.
But there's no phones allowed on the tours, so you are in.
Yeah.
Right? And when they walk out, you do see in a lot of them that their perspective has changed.
Yeah,
and
they're quiet. They're thinking.
They're thinking, and they're talking about the stories.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's what this is about. Yes, it is a tourist. It's a tourist attraction.
Yeah, for sure.
But we want to immerse the audience and educate the audience the best way that we can. And by having that actor guide you through these spaces, it's unlike any other tourist attraction around, really.
Yeah, it really does feel, it's hard to explain to people, but because we are so used to television and the computer and seeing the recreations on the big screen, to feel it. I mean, it's the difference between a movie and seeing a play on stage, right? You have a very different connection with both the players and the audience. And I think adults react to it too.
For sure they do.
Yeah.
For sure they do. And I think adults who come with their children, it's a very similar reaction. It's a full family learning experience.
Yeah.
And they come out of the tour, they're looking at the pictures in our ticket office and talking about the times. And because adults are just as guilty of the social media craze as well. So
right, or just forgetting to tell those stories. I mean, I always regret not spending more time with grandparents, because when you're a kid, you're very self-centered, right? Mm-hmm. It's your world and you're living that, and not hearing more from what they went through and what they learned. I mean, my grandmother was a homesteader, for God's sake. It's hard to imagine. Like, we don't want to be anywhere without air conditioning.
Right. Yeah.
So those stories are there. What's next? Are there any
Right now we're
Just trying to come back.
just trying to come back. Yeah,
Yeah.
we were closed for a while. We're dealing with labor shortages
Yeah.
out here. I'm
Everywhere in the country.
everywhere in the country, and I'm sure you saw me
Yeah.
kind of running in
Yeah.
and out before we got started here. There's, we really don't have a big labor pool,
Yeah.
and I don't know what has led to it, because there are,
Nobody can figure this out.
yeah,
Like there was a lot of people went home, but not every job was able to be done at home.
right.
And people wanted to work, and I mean, this is puzzling the economists too. Where did everybody go?
Right, and I think, maybe part of it is people realize that life is more than working. I don't know.
Yep.
So they're willing to make a change in their
Yeah.
lifestyle. I know I did. I left my previous job before COVID.
Yes.
But then when
But for the same reasons.
But for the same reasons,
Yeah.
right? I needed a change, and I think when COVID hit you in the face,
Yeah.
you look at what's important to you.
Yeah. What
So,
matters.
Yeah.
Well, and now you're trying to get the business open. You got 2 young boys, and you'll be busy.
Yeah, I'm a very, very, very busy man. Yes.
Bobby, it's so great to see you, and I really wish you luck with this, because once people get a taste of it, I think that they will tell the stories. So what's the best way for people to go and look?
Visit our website,
Yeah.
tunnelsofmoosejaw.com.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah, we ask that you book ahead, because we are quite busy,
Yeah, that's great.
and we don't want disappointed tourists.
Yeah.
So,
On Main Street in Moosejaw, Saskatchewan. This is very familiar turf to me, and I'm so glad that you're making a business out of it, but you're also telling our story. It's great. Bobby Hill, General Manager of the Tunnels of Moosejaw. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll talk soon.